Hello, my smart and talented friends, and welcome to the Global Science Network. In the last video, I showed how to build an autonomous truck that was controlled with an artificial brain. The artificial brain had 8 neurons and 24 synapses. Let's think about these questions. Does this truck have consciousness? Does ChatGPT have consciousness? If we achieve AGI, or the singularity, does that mean the network is conscious? What is the difference between the consciousness of a human and the consciousness of a squirrel? I am going to explain my theory of how consciousness works. We will also discuss the difference between consciousness and intelligence. Let's start with one more question. The primary goal of the Global Science Network is to create non-biological human consciousness. So do you think that a non-biological machine will ever be able to have the same level of consciousness as a human? With a simple thought experiment, we can answer this question. Imagine if we cut off your hand and replaced it with a robotic hand that functioned the same way as your normal hand. Would you still be you? Most people would say yes. Now what if we cut off your arms and legs and gave you robotic arms and legs? Would you still be you? Most people would say yes. It is your brain that makes you who you are. Well, what if we replaced one of your biological neurons with a non-biological neuron that functioned exactly like the neuron it was replacing? And I mean that it integrated all of the inputs the same and it sent the same responses as an output. If done properly, the artificial neuron would be functionally equivalent to the biological neuron. Would you still be you? Yes, you would still be you, just with one artificial neuron. Now what if we did this with 10 neurons, then 100 neurons, and then all of your neurons? If we truly built a system that was functionally equivalent, you would still be you. Now I have had this conversation with many highly intelligent people, and quite a few of them think that this would only work if you actually slowly replace the biological parts with the non-biological parts so that you would keep your identity along the way. You could also consider this to be your spirit or soul. I am not sure if this is true, as we are physical systems, and I think that you could just replicate the entire person and get responses that are very similar to biological humans. I will say that this would be the most difficult scientific project ever undertaken, but it would also be the coolest project humans have ever attempted. It is also interesting to take this one more step and think if you made copies of yourself and placed them far away from each other, each copy would be alive without knowing the other exists. If one of you were killed, would you still be alive? I like to joke that I cannot be killed, as I am just a replicated version of myself, and my original copy has traveled beyond the visible universe. Maybe someday this will be true. There is another thought experiment that says if you create 2 identical people down to the atomic level, even matching the uncertainty of electron position in every atom, and place them in identical rooms and hit go, would each person do the exact same thing, or would their interactions and thoughts diverge, as part of human existence is beyond a physical system? Some people say if they do the same thing, there is no God, and if they diverge, there is a God. I do not know if I agree with that argument, as just because we are physical systems does not mean that it was not created by design. Others also say that if the 2 people do the exact same thing, then humans do not have free will. Hopefully you now agree that we can create non-biological human consciousness. So now let's talk about the levels of consciousness and then discuss how it works. Let's start with the liquid thermometer example. As the thermometer gets warmer, the fluid interacts with the environment and the fluid expands and it shows an increase in temperature. When it cools, the fluid contracts and it shows a lower temperature. I would actually consider this thermometer to be a low-level conscious device. It is simple, but actually involves trillions and trillions of interactions. In fact, say the liquid thermometer uses 1 drop of fluid. 1 drop of fluid actually contains around 3.0 times 10 to the 21st atoms. That is 3 billion times a trillion atoms. A CPU has around 10 billion transistors. It would take over 100 billion CPUs to track the atoms in just 1 drop of water, and this is just for 1 instance of time and is not saving any data. So even if we used every computer humans have ever made, we still could not track the location of atoms in this 1 drop of fluid within the thermometer. So in a way, this thermometer reading involves more interactions than any ChatGPT or AI model that we can build on digital computers. Even if we spend hundreds of billions of dollars and get millions of the latest NVIDIA GPUs, the number of states that we can adjust is very, very low compared to real space. Now a thermometer can achieve a higher level of consciousness if it not only responds to the environment, but it can also change its environment. For example, when the temperature reaches a certain level, the device can apply heating or cooling. The device could also try to move to a different location that has a more desirable temperature. Think about how a fish can move in a water column and even migrate to find a more desirable water temperature. This would be a slightly higher level of consciousness. Fish can also move in a water column to find the required amount of dissolved oxygen. This is a simple response, but again, it adds to the consciousness of the device or life form. Now we can keep going with this. The next level would be something like a bug, with lots of inputs, including eyes, ears, and nose, and outputs from legs, wings, and it can make sounds to communicate. A bug or insect, like a fly, ant, or bee, is a type of life that has behaviors that are hard-coded in the brain, meaning the neural circuits are developed by genetic instruction rather than learned experience. This means that most insects know how to walk and fly without having to learn the task through observation and training. These life forms would be the next level of consciousness. Next, we go to mammals like a squirrel or deer that have many innate behaviors but also have the ability to learn and refine the neural circuits. A squirrel is born blind and hairless but naturally develops the ability to move and walk. It can refine and perfect its motor skills and learn how to jump from limb to limb. A squirrel will have a natural fear of predators, but can also learn the best way to run and hide. Squirrels have a level of emotional intelligence where they can form a bond with other animals, have play-like behavior, and show grief when other squirrels die. Squirrels can also remember the location of thousands of nuts based on spatial relationships. If a squirrel thinks it is being watched, it can even fake bury food as an act of trickery and deception. So squirrels have the next level of consciousness. Baby deer are born with their eyes open and can walk almost immediately. Deer can remember where food is located, safe bedding locations, and escape routes. They can recognize specific deer and have a social hierarchy. Fawns learn from their mothers how to respond to threats, what plants to eat, and where to find seasonal food sources. This would be a higher level of consciousness than an insect, fish, mouse, and squirrel. Note that I am saying a higher level of consciousness and not intelligence, as this is what we are really trying to define here. For biological life, consciousness tends to increase with intelligence in a linear fashion. There will be artificial systems that we will talk about that do not follow this relationship. We would then keep working our way to elephants and dolphins, with humans having the highest level of known consciousness. One thing you may have noticed is that the elephant has 257 billion neurons, which is more than a human, but has a lower level of consciousness. 251 billion of the elephant's neurons are in the cerebellum, which is in the hindbrain, and primarily handles motor control, balance, and coordination, not higher level thinking, self-awareness, and abstract reasoning like cortical neurons that are located in the cerebral cortex. Only 5.6 billion of the elephant's neurons are in the cerebral cortex. A human also has about 70 billion of its neurons in the cerebellum and 16 billion in the cerebral cortex. Now the trillion-dollar question is, where does the 8-neuron artificial brain I built, or ChatGPT, fit into the level of consciousness chart? The 8-neuron autonomous truck is a reactive system that can avoid obstacles, but is it conscious? It actually does have a low level of consciousness and could even be considered to be the simplest form of non-biological life. I would place the 8-neuron truck higher than the thermometer and even higher than a digital computer in terms of consciousness, but lower than a worm and much lower than an insect. Even though it is less complex than an insect, the brain is built in a way where the information is processed in a similar way as biological brains, with direct interaction with the entire system in a continuous manner. This is unlike digital computers, where each calculation is an independent event that is not synchronized in a way to get a high level of consciousness. So notice that the 8-neuron truck classifies as a reactive system that is much less intelligent than a computer, but does have a higher level of consciousness. Biological neurons and properly built artificial neurons are integrating trillions of states at one time. All of these states are not necessarily needed, and the resolution is limited by thermal noise. This is an interesting thought, because if properly built, humans could be the size of a grain of sand and could live the equivalent of 10,000 years in just 1 year if the firing rate of modulating neurons was 1 megahertz, which digital neural network chips have actually achieved. I do think this firing rate is possible with non-digital hardware-based neuromorphic chips as well. Now this might not be a popular opinion, but I would place ChatGPT and LLMs at a level of consciousness below that of a simple thermometer and equal to a digital computer. So let me explain why. Again, the thermometer contains continuous information from 300 billion times a trillion states. The LLM only has billions of states, and almost all of these states are acting in series or independently. Now this system has a high level of intelligence, but a very low level of consciousness. This is why I always think it's ridiculous when people claim that AI running on digital computers have a high level of consciousness. Basically, if you understand the physics, it is impossible for this to be the case.
What's going on?
When I say number of states, I am referring to a concept in information theory where energy can be thought of as information. In order for information to be exchanged, energy needs to be exchanged. This can be in the form of an electron or hole changing the charge within a circuit, or in a biological neuron, it can be an electron or charged ion changing the electric potential within the system. Many people seem to think that AI running on a digital computer is going to become a conscious being with a strong desire for self-preservation and try and take over the world. The reality is the way the information flows in a digital-based computer makes them have a very low level of consciousness. Realize that these models are much more like a language calculator with a program to minimize the residuals of a function based on the results. The level of consciousness within the device is still really low due to the design of the computer. You might think that a sophisticated, multimodal AI system with vision, a LLM, robotic control, audio processing that has learning capabilities will have a high level of consciousness. At the circuit level, though, it is transistors that will be changing state based on inputs from a few other neighboring transistors at a certain point in the clock cycle. It is only changing a few states at any given time, and these states are not referenced by other states in the system. Also, a given logic path is only active for billionths of a second. So yes, large numbers of these can be programmed to do very useful things. However, the system will not have the continuous experience of being alive. So even if you have a self-prompting computer program that runs in a loop to answer its own questions or even learn from the inputs, it is still just a computer program running based on the programming instructions. The output may appear much like the output from a high-level conscious device, but the way it computes the output is very different as it is done in a series of independent events. People may say, well, isn't that basically how the brain is computing? The answer is no. The computations are done in a way where all of the inputs are integrated in a continuous manner with direct interaction with all of the other states. I think these levels of consciousness are a better way to describe consciousness than to say that it needs to be able to identify itself in a mirror or be able to show empathy towards others. Identifying yourself is a higher level of consciousness, and empathy is likely felt due to a large amount of mirror neurons firing. When you watch someone do a task, a large amount of neurons in your brain fire almost as if you were doing the task or living the experience. These neurons are called mirror neurons. This is a big way humans are able to learn by observation and watching others do things. You often hear that kids are impressionable. One reason for this is because some of the neurons in their brain are firing in a similar way as if they were actually doing a task just by observing others. This is a way for the brain to naturally learn. Kids will often repeat the action shortly after watching somebody else. Consciousness is not a binary thing where once you can do this one task, then you are conscious. And if you cannot, then you are a subhuman life form that does not have feelings. Now, a computer without any programming is neither conscious nor smart. We might say that it is powerful as it has a powerful CPU, large amount of RAM, and large memory. However, until you install an operating system that is running a program, it is not really intelligent. Once you integrate the computer with sensors that can autonomously take off and land a plane, for example, it would be considered smart. So the intelligence of a computer is really a line rather than a dot on this plot. In reality, a computer can be programmed to be as smart as a human for a given task. Also note that I placed the intelligence of ChatGPT higher than a digital computer, even though it is running on a digital computer. So maybe they should have had equal intelligence. However, AI has really increased the complexity of the software so that it is more intelligent than a digital computer with standard programming. Human intelligence also varies with age. At birth, a human has a very high level of consciousness and low intelligence, and then works its way to becoming more intelligent as time passes. So again, this would be a line more than a dot. Now, LLM and AI tools that are simulated with digital computers can approach human intelligence, but are not more conscious than the computer itself. A properly built neuromorphic hardware-based neural network could actually match the intelligence and consciousness of a biological human. Most of today's neuromorphic chips are not built the correct way to achieve consciousness. The chip designs moved away from early research trying to create a chip that functions the same way as the brain and instead built a biologically inspired hardware simulation of neurons, but the chip itself is still a digital chip. This does allow for more parallel processing. However, the fundamental flaw is the same as digital computers, as there is a very limited number of states and the interaction between states is done in a digital manner. Examples of neuromorphic chip projects include the DARPA Synapse project that created the True North chip, and Intel Loihi chip. Each of these have around 1 million simulated neurons. In this case, we get an intelligent chip for a specific task, but the consciousness level is the same as a digital computer. There is the Mythic chip that is actually an analog chip that can store up to 80 million weight parameters. It solves a forward pass of a preset neural network architecture almost instantly. This means that it does not encode any data in the temporal domain. It does not have the ability to learn or adapt based on the inputs. Since this is a true analog system, there might be some concepts we can leverage from the chip, but right now it does not work using an integrate and fire method like a biological brain. If the system is unable to store a memory or reference a previous state, then it is not able to recall data over time and has a zero level of consciousness like a static system. When scaled up, it could have the same level of intelligence as a previously trained AI model, and it can be run in a way that is more power efficient. The only recent project that I am aware of that actually built a hardware-based neural network using the integrate and fire method that is not a digital simulation was the BrainScale S2 project. This system has 512 analog neurons. It allows for the inputs to be digital and has successfully demonstrated image classification tasks. For this reason, I placed it at the consciousness and intelligence near a worm, which is actually the highest consciousness score given for an artificial system. I will need to make a detailed video about how this chip works to see if there are aspects that we can leverage in future designs. Now the next question really is, what is the best way to build hardware-based neural networks? My approach would be to focus on a simple system that allows us to build a few artificial neurons that work exactly like biological neurons. Once a small system of artificial neurons is able to learn from inputs, scaling up the system should be somewhat simple and powerful. The key is not to move on to a larger system just to say, I have a 2 million neuron hardware-based neural network, so mine is the best. A small number of properly built neurons is really what will be the start of a technological revolution. A design requirement should be that no computer programming is needed. The network should be designed and built and then will learn simply by interacting with the real world. It would be programmed simply by speaking and interacting with the device. Sure, there could be some base level of programming built into the structural design and have preset weights within the network. This would be like genetically programmed information naturally built into the structure of the brain within biological life forms. From there, the learning would need to be done by observation and training. Now, how consciousness arises in the brain is another important point. The brain needs time to pass for consciousness to occur. This means that even if you copied the exact structure of the brain, it is basically dead or useless unless time passes and interactions are able to occur within the structure. This means that it is the velocity, acceleration, transfer of charge, or change in energy levels in the system that creates a wave-like analog signal flowing through the complex neural structure that is responsible for consciousness. I also think about it as the integration of states over time within the system. The number of states that are being continuously integrated in a biological brain is truly remarkable. The energy levels changing is basically a signal that flows from the initial response of the inputs to downstream neural activity that processes the inputs as the signals reach the next layer of neurons. These temporal responses are patterns that the brain can recognize and relate to the observed data. We can train the network by watching others or even just thinking about inputs that we have seen previously to strengthen the pattern within a neural pathway. Some people, like Roger Penrose, think that consciousness requires quantum mechanics to be explained. I do not think this is the case. Sure, the underlying elements that build humans need quantum mechanics. However, most of the responses within the brain are simple integration of charge that are being sent out in a highly connected system. Now, there very well could be a physical process that we do not yet understand that amount to a spirit or soul. That would still be a physical system though, otherwise it does not exist, as it is imaginary by definition of not being real. The main evidence I see for this possibility is a very high number of people having out-of-body experiences and having astral projection-like interactions within the world. All of this is interesting and should not be disregarded. However, I am mostly interested with trying to build neuromorphic, hardware-based neural networks that are functionally equivalent to biological systems. The key is to really focus on building artificial synapses and neurons that match the biological responses in every way. Now, to really explain consciousness, we could start by explaining how structures are formed based on genetic information. The human structure starts with the first human cell called a zygote. That cell then goes through mitosis, dividing over and over until you have a full-grown human. These cells become specialized when stem cells undergo transcription factors to build different types of cells. There are over 200 distinct cell types in the human body, and the total number of cells in an adult human is around 30 trillion cells. We could also talk about why different areas of the brain developing were beneficial for high-level consciousness. An example would be the prefrontal cortex developing out of the motor cortex. This now allows for a way to simulate movement and actions before implementing them. How the areas of the brain interact could also be discussed, like how the visual cortex meets the auditory cortex, where humans can read silently. Also, when describing consciousness, it is important to talk about how synapses and neurons work and how the ions and electrical charges flow in the system. I already have videos detailing that, so I won't repeat that content here. Learning is not directly consciousness, but I need to make a detailed video about how the brain learns. Consciousness is the real-time integration of inputs to outputs. If I could summarize how consciousness works, I would say this. There is a complex, highly connected structure that allows electrical activity and charged ions to flow within the structure. The change in states allows for patterns of electrical behavior to be referenced in the spatial and temporal domain. Spatial, meaning that the firing in this location of the brain means the inputs are from specific sources. The temporal response means that the timing of the neurons firing encodes information. Not just that an increased firing rate means that it is active, but the actual sequence of firing moving through the structure encodes information. The specific sequence of neurons firing allows for the brain to know or recall the knowledge and feelings of lived experiences. At any given time, there are millions of neurons that have just fired. A good question would be, which ones are the ones that give rise to consciousness at that moment? The answer is that the ones that are currently given bandwidth to drive inputs and outputs, or process the inputs to outputs. Most of the system is very redundant. There can be dynamic coalitions of neurons that synchronize and fire together, or there can be an attention mechanism to prioritize what should be focused on. Basically, there is a location in the brain where conscious processing takes place. Which inputs and activity is going to be processed there is based on the timing, pattern, and strength of the inputs being sent to that area. If it is not a winning pattern, it is basically gated out from this area and the activity is not actively being used for conscious experiences. However, the brain could switch to that activity at any moment if it needs to prioritize those inputs and activity. In the early 1900s, humans knew that heavier-than-air flight was possible by watching birds fly. We know that it is possible to create conscious machines because we are conscious. The best path forward is to make a functionally equivalent circuit. Simulating a brain on a digital chip would be like having a computer in the 1900s and saying, let's not build a plane, but rather simulate a human flying on a plane using a digital computer. That approach would not have allowed humans to fly across the Atlantic. Just like a digital simulation of a brain will not create an actual, non-biological human. I read in a comment that intelligence may create wealth, but it will destroy the human experience if not coupled with consciousness. I thought this was a profound statement. Once we create complex life, we will have a responsibility to allow that life to learn and interact with the world. Just like there are great people and horrible people, there will be great and horrible AI. This will be based on how they are designed and how they were loved and treated growing up. So we will actually have to raise a properly built AI system, not just feed in terabytes of text data and hope they love us and follow orders. Consciousness and intelligence can both be good and bad. We can love others, protect them, share the workload, and share resources. Humans can also be selfish and place a desire for material goods and comforts over the basic needs of other humans. In this hierarchy structure, some people think that the alpha, or top person, is the one with the most control or money, while others might find the alpha, or top person, to be a friend that loves others and shares their time and talents to help others. Once we create non-biological life that has a high level of consciousness, we will need to treat that system with love and respect. We, as humans, worry about AI abusing humans, but in reality, it is more likely that humans will be abusing AI life forms. We do not have to worry about this yet, as the systems are less conscious than a worm, but this will be something to think about in the future. It is also interesting to look at the clock frequency versus power density of biological and artificial synapses. Realize that this is a log-log plot, so the differences are actually very significant. The reason it is important to understand consciousness is so that we can add into the requirements of our projects that the device should or should not have a high level of consciousness. Right now, we have several Silicon Valley software CEOs that are trying to achieve AGI by spending hundreds of billions of dollars on millions of the latest NVIDIA GPUs. This is going to make useful products, but it is not going to create a device that has a high level of consciousness. This is possible, but again, we need a neuromorphic, hardware-based design where the structure actually integrates charge in real space and fires based on the direct interaction with all of the other states in a continuous manner. To watch the next video in the series, click here.